Horror manga are always fun to talk about, whether talking about the art or how it uses the lack of sound to its advantage, or if it's talking about the sick mind of someone like Shintaro Kago. Someone that is always a pleasure to look at is the man that transcends the niche itself, becoming one of the most mainstream mangaka of all time, Junji Ito. But today we will look at the man that inspired Junji Ito, one of the defining mangaka of the 60s and 70s, the grandfather of horror manga, who almost lost his life in the process, Kazuo Umezu. Manga was at a very different stage in the 60s entering the 70s. Many of the defining mangaka that would inspire the titans of the industry today were still making a name for themselves during this time period, taking massive leaps forward with what could be done with the medium. Go Nagai and his Devilman, Ashita no Joe and its massive impact on sports manga and sports culture in Japan, and Tezuka with his Astro Boy and hundreds of other creations. Horror manga specifically was at a very different stage pre-1960s. When you think of horror in manga, typically things such as grotesque violence and body horror primarily come to mind. But during this time period, that wasn't the case. Instead of contorting bodies and skin-crawling monsters, they were mainly moralistic ghost stories. In a post-war period of Japan, you could get rental-only manga, which would have these short horror stories that leaned into folklore and ghost tales. Kaidan was a magazine that ran these type of stories from 1958 until 1968. With a focus of retelling old stories to attract a younger audience. A more popular example would be Shigeru Mizuki's Gegege no Kitaro, bringing a lot of popularity to yokai. Fun fact, this man was a multiple-time award-winning author and lost his arm during the war before becoming a mangaka. These stories had their roots in the traditional Kaidan tales from back during the Edo period. Peony Lantern was adapted into a ghost story, for example, that placed an emphasis on karmic retribution. So instead of eldritch beings and serial killers, it was, ooh, be a good person or else, ooh. Although granted, being not too far removed from World War II, I kinda get it. In all seriousness, there is a good amount of war/post-war trauma dressed in a supernatural coat. This approach of haunting ghost tales would still remain, but a drastic change was about to occur. In 1965, Umezu created Reptilia. Well, originally it was 3 separate stories released throughout 1965 and 1966, which were then pieced together. A shoujo horror following a girl whose mother is possessed by a snake lady. So now she has to survive this monster that is trying to eat her, while failing to convince everyone that her mother has been replaced. Ultimately getting her mother back, and for the rest of the story, she has to survive encounters with this accursed snake woman as she inhabits the bodies of other people. This series was a fun read, and I could for sure see how Junji was inspired, but this would serve as the breakout series for Umezu. Achieving success after a decade of working on manga, he finally had his break. But with that success, he pushed harder with his next 2 major works. Right after Reptilia, he began Cat-Eyed Boy, which ran from 1967 to 1976. This series follows a strange boy with monster-like features, cursed with the fact that misfortune follows him wherever he goes. Even when he tries to help people escape from the monsters or supernatural disasters, he's still treated as an outcast and blamed for their suffering. It's part horror and part tragedy, a story where the horror doesn't just come from the grotesque creatures, but from the cruelty of people themselves. Unlike Reptilia, which focused on a central monster as the source of horror, Cat-Eye Boy unfolded more like an anthology, with the titular boy acting as both participant and witness to a rotating cast of supernatural terrors. One week it might be a gang of 100 monsters, another week a cursed statue, or even something as surreal as a meatball-shaped demon representing a hereditary cancer curse. I'm not making this up. What makes it stand out is how it blends folklore, almost fairy tale-like morality with a modern edge of psychological horror. The series carried an unpredictable energy. You never knew what kind of creature or punishment would show up, and that gave it a very different feel compared to his earlier work. In many ways, Cat-Eyed Boy is where Umezu really established his identity. Grotesque, imaginative, and unafraid to use horror as a mirror for the ugliness of human nature. While talking about horror manga is fun, what isn't fun is talking about the life of a mangaka. To be more precise, the schedule they often take which destroys them slowly but surely. There isn't a number he ever gives, but what we can do is look at the context of his contemporaries and the context of manga magazines at the time. For example, Osamu Tezuka, the god of manga, was producing an average of 10 pages a day across his career, over 150,000 pages total. He often slept only 3 hours a night, working out of his office and rotating between multiple projects at once, to the point that his last words on his deathbed were, "I'm begging you, let me work." Go Nagai, another giant of the era, was once handling 5 separate weekly serializations simultaneously in 1972, an output that would have demanded 14 to 18-hour workdays just to keep up with the deadlines. Just like today's series that weren't popular could easily be axed, and it is a harsh truth that all because you find success in a creative endeavor doesn't mean that that will be the case every single time. A horrid, anxious feeling that reaches its height whenever there are setbacks. This reached its peak during the time period for Umezu, but it wasn't just working on the Cat-Eyed Boy. During this time period, he was working on 3 monthly series and 3 weekly series, most notably Orochi as well. Given what we know about Tezuka often reported 12 to 16-hour workdays, many times only sleeping 3 hours, and Nagai at the peak of his overworked state having a similar schedule, it could be safe to say that these men were working 85 to 110-hour work weeks due to their insane love for making manga, but also the reality of this being their job in a competitive environment with strict deadlines. To top it all off, Umezu refused to work with assistants. Remember, this was far before the digital era as well, so imagine ink spilling over or not liking how a page turned out at the end of the inking process, which must have happened a decent amount given Umezu was known to be a perfectionist. While I can sympathize with having an unhealthy schedule, this is just brutal, and even that doesn't seem to be the right word to describe not only the physical harm, especially long term, but the mental harm in the moment. Yes, the real horror was having a job! At my busiest, I was doing 3 monthlies and 3 weeklies simultaneously. Cat-Eyed Boy, Orochi. I was drawing like a madman. The work was physically demanding. I could feel my strength slipping away and thinking, this time tomorrow, I'll be dead. One would think that due to this, he would have stopped, and these works had have remained incomplete. Call it a career after 15 years of being a mangaka. Nope. Even as his body was giving out from the brutal workload, Umezu would go on to create what many would consider his magnum opus, The Drifting Classroom. The strain was still there, but now it wasn't just about keeping up with deadlines, it was about pouring everything he had left into a story that would define his legacy. I actually read The Drifting Classroom a while ago with many other horror manga for a video, and to my delightful surprise, it was one of the better reads in that list despite being far older. The premise is simple but terrifying. An entire elementary school suddenly vanishes from its place in the city and is transported to a barren wasteland where survival seems impossible. From there, the story spirals into chaos, starvation, disease, panic, betrayal, kids turning on each other while the teachers lose control. What makes it so effective is that it doesn't rely on one monster or curse. The horror comes from the collapse of society itself when stripped away of all structure. Umezu took the supernatural framework of his earlier works and merged it with a raw, almost post-apocalyptic tone that pushed horror manga into new territory. It wasn't just creepy monsters anymore, it was psychological terror, human desperation, and the kind of moral breakdown that still makes it feel fresh decades later. The series was so impactful that it won a prestigious manga award in 1974, cementing not only Umezu's place as the grandfather of horror manga, but also showing the industry that horror could stand shoulder to shoulder with the biggest genres of its time. Umezu would later have a stint in comedy, most notably Makoto-chan, but by the 1990s, years of physical abuse caught up to him. Tendinitis forced him to stop drawing entirely, the one thing he loved most. While being able to come out with one of his best works after such extreme overworking shows incredible drive. It's also a reminder of the human cost. This isn't unique to Umezu. Tezuka, Nagai, and many others endured punishing schedules, and the industry often treats creators like machines instead of humans. These are people with limits, not just entertainment factories. Umezu's life is a testament to passion and obsession, yes, but also a warning. Behind every masterpiece is a human being who can be broken. And so we come full circle to the opening quote. The greatest horror Umezu faced wasn't on the page, it was in his day-to-day life. Deadlines, exhaustion, and the constant pressure to create. He survived, and left a legacy that terrifies and inspires. But we should never forget the human cost behind the art we love.